This is the Money Man, Gary Sasse. Cha-ching. Welcome.
Good to be here.
Good to be here. It's a booming economy, low unemployment, good stock market, all that kind of stuff, but little curveball over the weekend to the state government, missed court date, and a price tag of $24 million, I believe. Plus, I'm sure there's interest in other accruals. This does not look like a mistake that is escaped out of it easily. A disaster?
Disaster is a strong word. I think it's an unexplainable embarrassment. You know, the chairman, Democratic chairman of the Legislative House Oversight Committee called it a complete, unabashed incompetence. And I think that pretty well describes it. So the people of Rhode Island have to ask the question why, after 3.5 years, this administration is being accused of another unexplainable embarrassment. And it was a pretty simple case. Basically what happened was that for fiscal 16, the legislature cut the Medicaid reimbursement in nursing homes by 2%.
Right.
That was never intended to be a permanent cut, but the state treated it as such. Nursing homes went to court, sued, they won. The state had a right to appeal that judge's decision, and they missed the deadline. Not only did they miss the deadline, there were higher-ups in state government, from administration to the head of the Executive Office of Health and Human Services, to heads of departments within that agency, that had no idea what was transpiring. That's the embarrassment. The lawyer effectively was not licensed to practice because I'm told he didn't keep his certificate up for continuing education. His superior didn't tell anybody about it. And I have to give the legislature credit. If you go back and look at the minutes and some of the questions that came from the House fiscal staff, they constantly inquired, where was this lawsuit? And nobody in the administration knew about that. That's unexplainable. Now the administration is arguing, well, give us the hearing anyhow. And under certain circumstances, a judge can grant the hearing even though it's late if he thinks it's a public interest, if he thinks the state there's a prevailing situation, the state could win the lawsuit, or the old irreparable harm argument. Right. So it's not clear what the judge will do, but the embarrassment is unbelievable. There seems to be a snafu or a fiasco of the month over at that place. You know, we had UHIP, which doesn't seem to get better. We appoint a special master. Supposedly the SNAP program will be, up and running in a few more weeks. But that goes on. This comes on top, and you have to scratch your head and say, who's running the railroad? Who's in charge? And the governor issues statement, she's disappointed. Well, thank God she's at least disappointed, because we're all disappointed. There's a lot of taxpayer money at stake here, and she's taking all these trips to go to New York, West Coast, wherever, to raise money, political money. She has effectively a national campaign running for governor. She has more national endorsements than I think Hillary Clinton had, going forward. And it might be useful to take a few more trips down to Cranston and spend some time at her Office of Health and Human Services and really begin to ask questions. But I think it's at a point right now, I don't know how you get a special master appointed, but there needs to be an independent investigation. I think the taxpayers, I think the legislature, I think the others have given enough rope to this agency, and they don't seem to be able to solve problems. I think the current director is liked by the health industry. He's accessible. So I'm not going to start pointing fingers and saying, fire this guy, don't fire that guy. But I think the bottom line is, if you look at performance, you look at this kind of case, there needs to be a special master or an independent investigation, or an independent person given responsibility.
Well, I'll tell you, going into into this weekend, over the last couple weeks, the Raimondo administration had a series of significant positive announcements, Deepwater Wind and some other things. They seem to be ringing up some wins. The problem with this issue is it hits on this theme, as UHIP does, of somewhat incompetence coupled with not caring about these types of issues, not caring about health care and poor people and nursing homes, etc. And that's just not where their interest is as an administration.
Well, I think they care about those things, but I don't think they're professional in the sense that they get involved in the details and what's needed to get these things done. I can guarantee you almost that if this was the General Electric Company or some other national company that was interested in the state, we would not forget to file, whether it's a paper with the Secretary of State, with the Attorney General, whether we had to resolve a past lawsuit, we would have filed those things. These other things, just somehow get lost. And it raises a much more fundamental question, and you're raising the question, of how this administration is organized. Where was the Director of Administration? I served in that office. I had a pretty good idea of what major litigation, where there were contingent liabilities for the state were coming along. Where was the director? Where was legal counsel? And who in the governor's office was on top of this? This is pretty, from an administrative perspective, it's pretty inexcusable. It's not even government 101.
Well, and there's so many flaws, right? I mean, even if they had filed the appeal and gone to argue, the lawyer that was going to be arguing for the appeal is not a licensed attorney. I mean, raising huge questions about oversights, maybe throughout state government, of what the quality is of our in-house counsels. That seems fairly shocking. The other element of this is that they're really clearly on a massive multi-million-dollar lawsuit, that there's no checks and balances, that it could be left to a mid-tier in-house staff attorney as being the only person with first-hand knowledge of when the deadlines were and things like that.
Well, it really raises the question of how the governor's cabinet functions. Is the governor's policy being directed by associate chief of staffs that have portfolios?
Yeah.
How much contact does the governor have with her key department heads? What kind of briefings are given, and who are those briefings given to? The other issue, in fairness to this situation, I was around when the Executive Office of Health and Human Services was created, and keep in mind, before that period, we had a Department of Elderly Affairs, we had a Department of Youth Children, we had DHS, we had, I forget what, MHRH we called it back then. And what was common to a number of those agencies is that they were spending Medicaid money. And we're talking about $2 billion here, we're not talking about change. And so it was felt it was needed to better coordinate and manage how the state was coordinating delivery of human services, but I think more importantly, how it was making decisions on Medicaid spending. So this office was created. At the same time, the various sub-agencies were still given Senate confirmation. At the same time, a good organizational plan, and this goes way back before this administration, was not put in place to transfer people from the departments to the central.
Is it too big?
Well, I don't know if it's too big. It's not well thought out because there's not a clear line of who's responsible.
But under this administration, it's 2 now directors in a row. I mean, in the course of 1 year.
Well, there are 2 directors, and
I mean, Liz Roberts was fired just a little over a year ago. Eric Bean was placed not even a year ago. It'll be a year next in 2 weeks.
Eric Bean was placed there because he had worked in the governor's office.
Has Eric Bean got the qualifications? He was a staffer for Malloy in Maryland. He was a entry-level Justice Department attorney. Kate Nagel was at the press conference today that he hosted, not the governor, and she asked him about the calls for his resignation from multitudes of folks, I believe Matt Brown, Alan Fung, Republican Party, etc. And he poo-pooed it as just political posturing. But, let's look at the record. $100 million over budget on UHIP post his appointment, and $24 million on this.
But let me put back to the administration. He was on the governor's staff.
Right.
He
trusted.
He
was probably a good staffer, and she liked him.
He did some good work on UHIP. I think he brought one of the people that really brought to broader attention what the scandal was and the fiasco with UHIP. He was placed over there in order to clean, that was his major portfolio, to clean that up because he had demonstrated some knowledge and some experience, with it. They never did a national search, you know, beyond that point. Maybe it was too late in the administration to do a national search, but they didn't do what one would be expected to do, a national search for a position like that.
Size.
And so instead of picking on old Eric, it really gets back to how this governor is governing. You know, does she have a strong cabinet? Are there cabinet meetings where important information is shared?
As I understand, they do not have formal cabinet meetings.
I'm just asking. I don't know the answer. I'm raising questions. Are there associate directors, chiefs of staff, you know, running portfolios?
Did Kachuri have formal cabinet meetings?
Oh yeah, we had them all the time.
Sunland did.
Oh
and,
yeah, those were.
And Sunland's meetings were never more than an hour and incredibly brutal.
They were pointed. I would refer to them.
I would call them brutal.
Pointed was yes.
You're speaking in kind vernacular.
When I was for the first 6 months, I would attend those cabinet meetings. Yes, and yeah, Kachuri had regular cabinet meetings. Sometimes the agenda, everybody on the cabinet. We think everybody on the cabinet being equal. You know, the director of administration is not the same as director of a small department. So there were sub-cabinet groups. There were different ways to work with the governor. But the question is she dealing directly with the cabinet people, or is it be through intermediaries and her, you know, staff in the department? There's always some of that. But when you get to a situation like we have at EOHS, you know, where there are just all kind of unexplainable embarrassments going forward, you would hope there was a more hands-on role. I don't know the answer to that question, but what happened today raises. You know,
does someone's head have to roll though? Someone significant. Let me just say this: you're now 4 months away from an election, 3 months away from a primary that has some competitiveness to it. From a standpoint of leadership, this is a major faux pas. This is back-to-back missed deadlines under the leadership at that department. Does something have to happen? That's
well, I think something should happen because, as the old adage, effective leaders accept responsibility. They don't run and hide. And you know what should happen? That's the question. You know, if you got rid of the existing head and you had 4 months, how would you recruit another permanent head? I think there's a much more basic.
Well, hopefully, you have somebody else in state government that you can move over there, or some other resource that you can tap in from an interim standpoint.
But how you govern is important too. You can put the most brilliant person there, and if you're not having good lines of communication, sharing information, knowing what's pertinent, you know, having that person be able to manage this.
So we seem to find out after the fact all the time, right? Missed deadlines, letters from the federal government. On and on and on and on and on. Does it need a third party to go in there and dig into this?
You just hit the right, I think the absolute right point. So you replace the current head of that department. The learning curve between now and election is going to be pretty steep. But what you can do, and if the governor needs to stand up and accept responsibility directly, but not just say I'm disappointed and I accept responsibility. Appoint an independent investigator. I don't know what the right independence would be. I'd like to see, a special master. I'd like to see that taken completely out of the administration's hands and have a special master report. But you don't have the judiciable issue yet to possibly do that. But short of that, an independent investigator or appoint an independent person that will be reporting directly to the governor on a daily and a weekly basis with a portfolio to expose.
So when warmer and cooler happened, it was on a Monday. It got worse and worse during the week. By Friday, the head of tourism was forced to resign. We're on a Monday again. We've had an Eric Bean press conference. I don't think anybody was wonderfully satisfied with the narrative that came out of that. What does she need to do?
She didn't need to do exactly what I just said. Is to hold her own
today.
Well,
tomorrow morning.
This week, hold her own press conference. But it's not just holding a press conference to explain what happened and why it happened and to apologize to the people of the state and say, I accept responsibility. Those are words. There has to be an action part of that press conference. And 4 months before an election, the decisions are not easy, but I think the most fundamental decision is say the structure doesn't work, the governance is broken down, I'm going to do two things. I am going to appoint and work with the various stakeholders in the state, an independent person that has extreme responsibility and has a lot of flexibility to do what has to be done and not going through all the
Is Bob Mueller freed up yet down in Washington?
Well,
could he come up?
If you think they were doing criminal things, which I don't think was the case. Yeah.
I did not say there was anything criminal.
That's what he did.
Criminally incompetent in the case of some attorneys.
But I think give extraordinary power to an independent person. To run that, to deal with legislation. Legislature's hands are not without some stain on this too. Legislature talks about oversight, but your example of having this oversight after the horses got out of the barn and run 5 furlongs, the horse is already sweating. You got to put him back in the barn.
And I got to say, I appreciate what Pat Serpa does and Patricia Morgan and all the members of oversight. I think they've done on all these things done a pretty good job bringing attention to it. But they haven't used subpoena powers. They haven't secured documents. They haven't asked the departments for every document of exchange with federal agencies. It seems like it's always after the fine gets levied, after the disaster hit, kind of thing. And even the best and the brightest, where we've got I think a widely respected federal special master overseeing just the food stamp, the SNAP program failure of UHIP, and he missed his own deadline in May and is now saying he's going to hit his deadline in June, and we'll find out if he hits his deadline in June.
You need to do 2 things. You need to get an independent person, in to either be the independent investigator or be the special master.
Yep. You
have both those options, and it is practical. And the second thing she has to do, which it's late in the administration to do it, is to look at what EOHH is, why it's failed, why it continues to have these problems, and really promote a plan to reform it. It may need to be the Department of Medicaid, all the Medicaids together, and separate out some of the other things. But think about this: you got a department that has Medicaid, it has responsibility for operating institutions, and has responsibility providing social services. Well, those are 3 things that you could break that down into 3 departments: institutional care. Now the problem with that is that they get Medicaid money too, so you have back that coordination problem. But there are options to look at. This organizational structure, it's not working.
But also, we think it's big here in Rhode Island. There are other states that have these same functions under the same heading that are 100 times bigger.
But you look at the organization, and why would you want to have a Senate confirm department heads within an organization? The whole concept of a secretariat
is to manage all those different functions within.
Bring them together.
Let's jump over to a completely different issue. Last week, I think it was Tuesday leaked out, Wednesday was, no, I think it was Thursday actually, Wednesday or Thursday. Speaker of the House, Nick Mattiello, came up with a new PawSox funding scheme. That funding scheme, according to him, removed any taxpayer risk. It was a non-secured bond structure. Mm-hmm. Your successor, John Simmons, I don't know if he was your exact successor, but over RIPEC said that may cost on an annual basis as much as basis points coupling up to $800,000 on an annual basis on a 30-year bond.
It's going to cost about 50% more for the interest. Yeah, it's going to cost somewhere between $20 and $30 million. Yeah, John.
And on Thursday night before House Finance, a number of people spoke in favor of it, the big supporters, including Stephen Pryor, Secretary of Commerce, and he said, this is a good bill, let's move passage. By the next morning, Governor Raimondo, on a radio interview with Gene Vellicenti, said, I got to tell you, this doesn't get us unsecured. If the Pawtucket Redevelopment Agency collapses under a failed project, we'll have to bail them out. Where are we on this, this mess?
There's not enough details to answer that question, but I would tell you this, that if the Pawtucket Redevelopment Agency had a pure TIF bond, it's not unreasonable to assume that would cure the deficit, and bondholders wouldn't expect the.
You'd have to have revenue. When I was on the council, the Manchester Street station.
You raised the 2 different questions. The first question you raised is because
to pay off a bond, you need to have some form of revenue.
But there are 2 questions. So we got past the issue about whether it's appropriate or not. If you voted in the legislature tomorrow, they would vote to subsidize the ballpark. So that's done. The question that we're debating is how do you effectively manage the risk. They, the Speaker felt that the proposal that went through the Senate and it was negotiated with the Poor Sox didn't manage the risk. So he said we create, this TIF. And the TIF then...
Super TIF,
the
giant TIF.
The super TIF. And theoretically, I'm just talking about theoretically, if there was a pure, TIF, those could be non-recourse bonds. And in the case of...
Have we ever done that before in Rhode
I'm not
Island?
familiar with anybody's done it before. And so in the case of a potential, default, the investors would understand they were non-recourse bonds and would kind of come back on the state. That's the theory.
Yeah.
Okay, now how does the theory...
This looks like the spirit of Jim Skeffington. We're going to do a financing scheme that no one has ever done before, and of course there will be no moral obligation.
People have done it before. I'm not familiar with doing it here. Okay, now there are a couple of questions, and if you do that, where you end up is that the debt deal does not have any explicit government backstop. Okay, so now this is where the liabilities are, because first of all, the TIF. How big does this TIF have to be? And if the TIF gets so bad, it can adversely affect the finances of the city of Pawtucket. Don't know the details.
No one does.
Details on that. Is there going to be some language in there that no one's going to figure out till the end, where there's a backdoor pledge, from the state? Don't know that yet. Haven't seen the details. Always very suspicious of that.
But just stop right there. If there's going to be that backdoor, or as the governor said, the state's going to be obligated one way or the other.
No.
Hold on 1 second. Why would you ever do this super TIF structure where your financing costs are 50% more expensive? Why wouldn't you just do a regular RB or a regular GO?
Because what you're doing, and you're basically paying a premium to avoid future risk. It's buying insurance, effectively, that if I spend more on interest, I avoid future risk. Now, but the point I want to make.
But didn't we do that on the moral obligation of the 38? We had the insurance policy on that, which was never triggered. The legislature said, "Oh, let's go down and talk to Standard & Poor and Moody's. Can we default on it?" They said, "Of course you can default on it, but we're going to drop you 3 rating levels."
But this is if you have bonds sold by a redevelopment agency,
okay,
and then you create a TIF, to pay those bonds, and something happens, and
that the revenue doesn't come through as anticipated.
There's a default. If there are cases, I think, where if you sell pure, revenue bonds backed by a TIF, you're not, the full faith and credit's not there, and no one expects it to be there. The problem you run into is the next step. This is what I really want to get to. What happens if the TIF gets so big and the TIF fails? Then that affects the whole entire city of Pawtucket. If it affects the city of Pawtucket, then the state's back in the stew again. That becomes a state issue.
Let's go to the TIF for a second. When I was on the city council, Manchester Street Station got repowered. It was a $500 million investment, and obviously then Narragansett Electric did not want to pay the incremental tax, so there was a trade. There was a trade for a tax stabilization on that repowering. In exchange, the city built a TIF, dedicated the new incremental revenue to fund the TIF. Of course, Buddy spent it on painting houses and things like that. But there was a clear revenue stream, and there was something dedicated. It was National Grid. It was an established corporate entity. In this situation, you have nothing on top of nothing.
No, well, you have
a retail, maybe a retail play in Pawtucket.
That's what, well, and that's, you hit on the real issue, because there are some people who said they would, redevelop around the stadium. And what question hasn't been answered yet, and this is what deals with the soundness of the entire proposal, is a timing question.
Sure.
If I would build a ballpark, and the day I opened the ballpark up, there was redevelopment around the stadium, or redevelopment within a year around the stadium, then that's one set of circumstances where I then could be producing money, from the TIF. If it takes 12 years to develop the land around the ballpark, then I'm really in
Freddie Carpinato's got a property over behind Providence Place Mall. They tore down the produce market and was going to build retail. Retail market changed. He never built anything. It's 10, 12 years later. He's now looking at apartments. By the way, he's in no rush to build those apartments.
Okay, so there are 3 risks. So, but see, separate the legal issues. See, we're all getting hung up on, whether the state has to backstop a TIF. And I'm saying that depending on the way it's structured.
I'm not saying it. The governor of the state of Rhode Island went on the radio saying 14 hours after her subordinate said no, she said yes.
Well, then, and I think if that they decided she misspoke. The communications is not the strong suit of the administration right now, so we agree on that part.
If they could dedicate the $24 million that they were supposed to win from the
yeah. So we're communicating. But I think I want to separate these 2 points that are important. Theoretically, can you have a pure TIF-backed bond that?
Would you buy those bonds?
No, but theoretically, could you have a
when the money man says he's not buying those bonds, Wall Street listens. Was that E.F. Hutton?
E.F. Hutton, yeah. They went out of business. So, but the point being, seriously, could you have a pure TIF-backed bond that would not involve the state as a cure for default? The answer is yes. But having said that, that's the financing theory. There are 3 contingent liabilities that ought to scare the hell out of us. The first is the size of the TIF and the impact it has on Pawtucket finances. Because if Pawtucket finances go south, the state has a problem. The second is the unknowns about when the area will be developed and when the TIF will start producing revenues for this.
Gary, I'm going to jump in on this one. I'm not feeling good about retail development in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. The last time there was retail development in Pawtucket, Rhode Island was Apex in 1860 something.
I wrote an air conditioner Apex before they closed. But
they had a good sporting goods department.
No, but the point I'm being is, separate in your own mind. Can you have a pure TIF and that be the cure for and no other cure for default is there? The answer is yes. But I'm saying what we don't know is how big the TIF will be, how it affects the finances of Pawtucket. We don't know when the retail will be developed and when there'll be cash and revenue will start to be generated. And the other thing we don't know, which I'm surprised no one's talked about yet, the International League can move their teams in there. The International League owns a franchise, don't they? Mm-hmm. So they could own and move this franchise anytime they wanted. And without a 30-year lease guarantee from the International League, then you really have a liability that you can't manage or control.
There's numerous other questions relative to maintenance, to upgrades, to a host of different factors tied to this proposal. We're now getting towards late in the session. It's election year. I'm not speaking out of school. The response from members in the building, I think it's fair to say, is horrified at this latest turn, that this has made it far more complicated. If people didn't like it before, they really don't like it now. And now you've got this other X factor in finances of potentially $24 million over there. I think we're going to wait and see for wild and woolly. Keep an eye on budget articles being implanted at the last moment. And some people's political fortunes may
I think
be in play on this.
Why don't you be very direct? I think when the Speaker pushes this through, it's going to be another very competitive race in his district. I think.
It was interesting that Steve Frias showed up at the House Finance Committee, gave testimony. House Finance said that he has gone door to door, outlined extensively what he thought the perception was in House District 15, and we'll wait and see. Mr. Moneyman, thank you as always.
My pleasure.
Arm wrestled. I know as a finance expert, the idea of a super TIF being implemented in our state is massively exciting from a standpoint of...
I'm just saying you got to be very precise in your language. If you talk about a pure super TIF, knowing how the markets work and understanding the markets, you could structure one and take further risk away from the state. But I'm saying the economics of the project, raise questions about the financial stability of the TIF. There are too many, unfortunately, there are too many unknown questions, and I don't think the public has seen the language yet. So until you see the language, you can't.
There's a bunch of complicating factors. There's some eminent domain language that sent everybody off crazy. Nobody has any idea how big the district will be that will, and whether or not that's an additional tax for people outside of really who are going to benefit from it.
And I think the issue is with 2 or 3 weeks remaining in the session, to have something this complicated come up, really kind of is a self-fulfilling prophecy that the legislature is not interested in what Joe Sixpack is worried about.
Yep. Thank you, as always. We're going to be right back with Saul Kaplan, Mr. Innovation. Want to thank the money man, Gary Sasse. Big issues facing the state of Rhode Island with big implications for the political fortunes and the electoral process. We'll be right back.